Yeah. I mean, like, I saw Preston yesterday, and he said that apparently his whole class was, like, gonna come here and watch. So, like, there's
okay, some people will come and watch it.
Yeah.
But also, yeah, was it actually?
I'll just bring the Preston to and, like, in my mind, he's just, like, I don't know. In my mind, I have no idea how old he is. And he's, like, I'm a junior.
Oh, yeah. I think he's a sophomore.
Okay.
Oh snap, we're both juniors. That's crazy.
Yeah. How's junior year of high school going?
It's like, it's okay. I kind of made it so the work wasn't that much. So kind of a lot.
I feel like college stuff's happening now, right?
Yeah, like, I've already taken 2 SATs. Ew. It's terrible.
My little sister's doing the same thing right now, too. She's a junior.
Yeah, but also apparently, like, everyone thinks AP testing is gonna get canceled.
Like, I think it's kind of a terrible idea to have,
like a ton of people in a room.
Yeah, and then, like, on top of that, a ton of people who might be sick come in contact with, like, a bunch of papers, which will go back to the central point of grading, where your graders will definitely get sick.
And everyone will be stressed, and that is not good for you.
Also, I'm gonna call Tim real quick because, like, I feel like he should probably. Hey, can you post it?
Hello. Hi. Here we are again.
Oh, is it?
All right. You two who are going to be on the panel, why don't you go sit?
On the okay, so you have just put up news. Classes canceled. Also,
this is the real deal.
What's that? Actually, didn't even see that.
We were misinformed. They told us this at everybody's signature.
Waiting on here.
George and I now.
Hi, how are you? Hi, Doug. I'm Wendy. I'm one of the event coordinators.
No, there's one more. Okay. Then we have
You got here, Richard.
I'm right-handed.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, Barb Alexander.
Nice to meet you.
Which one are you?
Drew Tackett.
How do you spell it?
H-R-U-V. Is that yes.
And you are?
I'm Leah.
Leah. Pleased to meet you.
No more classes, all events greater than 100 people are canceled.
Oh, yes. I'm happy to say bye to you. I'm doing this Friday and the next one. And so I just don't see ways.
Yeah, that was one in Wayne.
So we're still on.
And that was one at
Everybody that I had planned on meeting here to check in.
So good things going on.
Jim, you're here.
I think I've been to
Yeah, you're in the wrong spot.
Art is on his letters.
Okay. Well, yes. Us tomorrow, George, 1:30. We're going to do it in the house that I have, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the last for me.
I am actually. Yeah.
I'll show you this now.
If you sit over there, so then I can see.
Hi, I'm Drew.
Hi, nice to finally meet you. I'm trying to get a So nice to meet you. We'll talk after. I just wanted to say.
But this is just public comment stuff.
Y'all here? We're all here.
I'm doing this to me.
Hi, Barbara Alexander. And say your name again. Dio. Okay.
For whatever.
2 minutes. All right. Everybody. I know. Look at that. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
We also need Yep, I did. Just here, just love to see what you got. I brought us some goodies. And then
Second row.
Sorry. It's because the video.
No, it's just to have that. It was
Yeah, you can put
I
your
was
coat down.
invited to the first conference of
Go for it.
Centers.
Coats are
That's
fine.
the original. Turn it over. That's what
You guys ready?
We're ready.
Okay.
Shall we start? Ready to start? Okay. Welcome to everyone. We're holding this event in extraordinary times right now. Two of our panelists, Michael Dorsey and Catherine Savoy, aren't able to travel because of coronavirus concerns. But we're welcoming Barbara Reed Alexander to kind of fill in, so thank you so much. She generously agreed to do it at the last minute. But we're all delighted that the rest of you are able to make it. We're live streaming the event rather than having an audience. We want to welcome our live streaming people to the panel. Our panelists are going to introduce themselves in a minute. But first I wanted to just say my name is Tracy Easthope. I'm a 30-year environmental justice activist with the Ecology Center and a 2-time graduate of the University of Michigan. Part of my training was here in this building with Bunyan Bryant. The Ecology Center is really excited to have helped organize the events for Earth Day, the Earth Day celebration, and the founding of the Ecology Center. And many, many thanks to the team at SEAS that has worked in partnership with community groups to organize a lot of these events, many of which are going to need to be rescheduled. But we're particularly grateful to the History Department and Matt Lassiter for all of the amazing help that they've offered to us, the Ecology Center, and to the University of Michigan to explore our history, but also the crucial history of the 1970 Earth Day events. So we're we're marking the milestone of this event, not just to celebrate, but to learn from the past in order to be able to make change more powerfully and effectively in the future. So having student activists from the 1970s on campus seemed like a really great opportunity to have engage in a dialogue between students that are active now and students that were so crucial to the 1970 Earth Day organizing. So we're really excited to bring them together to explore what has changed, what remains the same, what we can learn from each other. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves in a minute here. But I just wanted to mention, given the critical global leadership of really young students, I'm really happy that we also have a high school student here with us, Lila Wadi. So with that, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll start a little dialogue. So Lila Wadi, do you want to start?
Hi, my name is Lila D, but I also go by Lila. I have been a member of the Sunrise Movement ever since the beginning of the summer, and I'm also a part of the Washtenaw County Climate Strike Coalition. And in the past, I've worked to bring a school-wide climate strike to my high school, which is Pioneer. And I've done so in September, and I'm planning another one soon.
Hi everybody, I'm Dhruv. I'm a junior here at U of M. I'm a climate justice activist here on campus. I'm part of the climate action movement. Done a little bit of work with the Washtenaw County Climate Strike. Been part of the divestment movement here on campus, divestment of fossil fuels, as well as been doing some I, in conjunction with all the other Earth Day organizers, have been working on some climate justice education here on campus and off campus.
Hi, I'm Dim. I'm a senior here at U of M Ann Arbor, and I am a climate justice activist. I work with the climate action movement as well as a lot of the Earth Day organizers, but I'm also the chair of an Asian American organization on campus. So a lot of my work involves how to involve people of color and frontline communities in climate organizing, and how to also utilize our voices so that institutions listen to us.
I'm George Coling. I was a student here 50 years ago at the School of Public Health. I was an organizer of the ENACT teach-in 50 years ago today and yesterday. I moved after that to Washington, D.C., for 45 years and was involved deeply in the environmental movement, and particularly the environmental justice aspects of that as a white guy in the 70s and into the 80s and 90s.
Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Reed Alexander. I'm a 1968 graduate of the University of Michigan. I found myself in Washington, D.C. in 1970 when Gaylord Nelson was forming the office to implement the first national teach-in on April 22, 1970. And I was asked to be the Midwestern coordinator of that event. After Earth Day, I was very involved in coordinating and heading up lobbying efforts by the newly formed Outcry for Clean Air and Clean Water to focus on the 1970 and 1972 federal legislation that led to cleaner air and cleaner water.
Great, thanks so much. Several of you mentioned environmental justice in your introductory remarks, and that's the first question we want to put to the panelists, is really the role of environmental justice in your current organizing for the current students, and also the way that environmental justice played out in the 1970s organizing around Earth Day. So if you could each share a little bit about how environmental justice informed your organizing and events and strategy and values and the work that you do. So Jim, why don't you start on that question?
I guess environmental justice wasn't really something that I was really in even my line of vision until pretty recently, because a lot of the activism that I was doing on campus were with Asian American groups, and it always seemed like issues that we cared about, whether it was undocumented, immigrants or data disaggregation, things like that, didn't really have a place in the mainstream climate change movement. But in the past year, with other organizers on this campus and in the surrounding communities, I've gotten a better sense of environmental justice being kind of what climate change activism should be about, in that we have to include anti-racist efforts and anti-imperialist efforts in climate change initiatives, because so many of the people who sometimes are most eager to change systems and institutions don't consider the needs of people of color, and even a lot of the activists aren't people of color. So I think for me, environmental justice is kind of completely synonymous with climate change activism. It's just that I don't think that the general public really thinks so. So I guess that's kind of a good starting point, and I'm sure the rest of the panelists can chime in.
Drew, do you want to talk a little bit more about on-campus organizing and environmental justice?
Sure, yeah. Just to step off what Dim has said so far, really environmentalism and environmental work should be a part of justice and not so much the other way around, I guess, where often environmental justice is seen as a component of environmentalism, and therefore all environmental work that we strive to do and that I believe we should be doing should have its roots solidly in decolonial work, specifically working to lift specifically working against oppressive establishments and oppressive institutions. As far as how that's informed the work that we've been doing, a lot of that has there's been a lot of internal work, first of all, just in climate organizing here on campus, and doing like internal teaching on the roots of the environmental movement, which have often been, like, at least in the modern sense of what the environmental movement is, have often come from a place of xenophobia. Some of the first big conservationists were had their policies and their ideas built off of xenophobic and eugenic xenophobic dialogue and eugenic policy. And so first of all, like, teaching and talking about the history of that pain, I guess, and then also talking about one, how marginalized and frontline communities affected, and two, how do they resist also, because often the work done by these communities, often out of necessity, is ignored and not considered as part of environmentalism. So really, like, highlighting that and putting a spotlight on it.
I think that's very well stated about how the centrality of justice in your approach on campus today. Leila, do you want to talk about high school, how the environmental justice issue plays out?
Sure. So before I joined any organizing movements, I actually had no idea what environmental injustice was, and I didn't even know it was a real issue. But from the moment I joined Sunrise, I realized that they actually always endeavor to center environmental justice in their work, and they hold equity and accessibility as some of their core values. So as we create our events, we always strive to give people from marginalized communities a voice, a platform, and an audience who will not only hear them, but listen to them. And I've also seen, as we work in coalitions, that we've invited other organizations that are pretty diverse, because people of color are usually the ones who live in those marginalized communities. And they're usually targeted by the companies who think that their communities are an okay place for them to trickle their pollution down into. And so as we work with these diverse organizations, we take into account their complaints, and we've shaped our demands around them, such as advocating for more affordable housing or for the unfairness of DTE. And it's been very eye-opening. And I'm very glad that I've learned what environmental injustice is, and that it has become extremely prevalent, and more people are finding out what it is as organizations and movements gain traction and momentum.
It's really helpful to hear, and interesting to hear about doing solidarity work across movements to the housing movement, which I think is a nice segue to ask those folks who've been around for a lot longer and who were involved in the 1970 organizing to talk a little bit about how environmental justice played out there. Today, Matt Lassiter from the History Department had an op-ed in the Washington Post talking about, actually, in the 1970s, that early cross-movement work that activists were doing. So it'd be great to hear from the two of you. George, you want to go first?
Yeah, and is Matt here? I'm sorry,
He's
I
not
haven't
here.
got on my...
He's not here.
I haven't got to the internet to read that that post. Term environmental justice certainly didn't exist in 1969 when we started organizing. It really came into popular parlance in the early 80s, but there was a lot of organizing work done, including some at the teach-in itself, as in the 60s. One person, a longtime friend of mine from DC, said when Martin Luther King went to Memphis, what was he doing? He was supporting striking garbage workers. I am a man. What were they striking about? Horrible environmental conditions on the job, you know. So there's kind of one marker. This is the program from 50 years ago. I looked through it a little bit, and there was one session on air pollution and climatic alterations of 100 workshops or something. There were quite a few on urban issues, the urban condition, individual and community perspectives. Most of these people appear to be academics, but they had students from Wayne State. I don't recall this workshop. I assume, they were from Detroit and not Ann Arbor. And we have this one, which I have not figured out looking back at this, welfare effects on pollution.
So a few
From
sessions that were
yes.
highlighting it.
And the one that I organized, I think, though, talks about how the issue was framed differently. And the issue was then and is now the disproportionate effect of pollution on marginalized communities, Lily, you said. But then there's the redressing of it, the justice of it. And that took a lot of work locally and nationally in the 70s and 80s. But this one workshop that I was involved in organizing is kind of from the perspective of what was going on then was the, in the term of the 60s, the urban unrest or the race riots in Detroit and other places, and the war and the anti-war movement.
We call them. Justice struggles, I think.
Yeah, right. They would be called that now. So there was a concern, as seen in this workshop title, which reflects the people, those of us that were organizing, and I think the faculty and the academics supporting us, was that the environmental movement would rob momentum from anti-war organizing and work in the inner city. But the title of this workshop is called Environmental Scream Out, an open forum on intellectual pollution, in other words, the diluting of the political battle with this new kind of white middle class concern. The diversion from the ghetto and the war. And it had several faculty members on the panel, a health analyst, James Kimmey, director of a consulting firm in New York, who was studying disproportionate impacts. He was later the executive director of the American Public Health Association, and a couple of community groups from Detroit that were invited to come in and talk. And this was done in the overall context of the Black Action movement was organizing on on campus, and a few weeks later there was a campus-wide strike. So it was questionable whether the group would come in from Detroit, and I have here in my 50-year-old file, this, folks, is an ancient form of communication, not hieroglyphics, but mimeograph. And it announces these folks and Randy Davis from Vanguard, that was the group. And this, the morning of March, whenever it was, this was all over campus, taped up, there's the tape, saying that this would actually take place. And again, the discussion was really not about justice so much, but a little bit about inclusion, but it was mainly kind of a back and forth with, as I recall it.
There were strong movements. There was the Black Action movement and a strong other justice movements. And I think there was, as I understand it, a lot of discussion about how those movements, what their role was in the Earth Day. And there was a lot of negotiation, and those movements were eventually incorporated into the celebration of the 1970s Earth Day.
Yes.
But it's interesting that I think we have some similar cross-movement tensions that have continued. And so, anyway,
Well,
Barbara, do you want to?
Yes. The early history of conservation movement in this country was in the 1950s and a good part of the 1960s, associated with protecting the land, protecting, the Audubon Society was protecting birds, the National Wildlife Federation was protecting wildlands and parks, and the notion of focusing on where people live and the pollution that was affecting lives and preventing the development of cities to enjoy anything close to clean air or clean water was the genesis for the popularity of the Earth Day activities. So right from the beginning, the national teach-in movement tried to focus on examples, the burning river of the Cuyahoga in Ohio, the smog in Los Angeles, focus on human beings and their adverse impact of pollution on them. And in fact, the Earth Day office resulted in a lot of work on clean air and clean water, which dramatically improved the air in most urban areas of this country. It was very successful in that respect. The environmental justice movement today, I think, is composed, or in my opinion should be composed, of two parts. One is who is being harmed the most by our current climate change crisis. And as with any, it's just classic that of course it would badly impact the poor, the minorities, the people who do not have the economic wherewithal to move away or to take mitigation action and avoid the impact. In Maine, it's the lobster industry, mostly family-owned, and they're the ones who are going to suffer in many respects. But the other issue is who is going to pay for the agenda to take action? And that is an area that I am working on through my work as a consultant on utility regulation. Too often I find that even national environmental organizations are imposing costs on electric and drivers of cars that are in effect increasing the cost for poor people in a subsidy that is helping rich people buy an EV or install solar on their roof. So that is a very interesting aspect of environmental justice that I think we should be looking at more carefully and focusing on in our debate about climate change.
I think that's helpful, and I think many in the climate movement have understood, are starting to understand, because of climate justice activists, how climate justice really needs to be the overall frame of the work that we do around addressing climate change. That unless it's a fully engaged movement grounded in justice and equity, we're not going to be able to actually make the scale of change that's necessary. So, and I think that's a great example of it. Mm-hmm. George, I don't know if you wanted to say something more about environmental justice.
In terms of an organizing strategy, Barbara mentioned that environmental actions work led quickly to coalitions to support the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, and she did an awful lot of shoe leather work on that, I know. The other way to kind of look at the issue and get at it was worker health and safety. And a classic example is the studies came out, I think published in 71 or so, if not 70, the highest rate of lung cancer, or put it the other way around, disproportionately higher rates of lung cancer and black coke oven workers. Big studies funded by the steelworkers and by Department of HEW in those days. Why? Because with the black migration to the north in the 30s and the 40s, the dirtiest job in the steel mill, good job, paid well, union job, was working inside the coke oven, cleaning it. So it was very clear, racial discrimination, lung cancer. Couldn't have been.
And Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW at the time, was a very critical part of the 1970 celebration and gave a quite famous speech as part of the events, talking about some of these disparities.
And he was also, the UAW was well behind Earth Day at the national level. Big
One of
funders.
the little-known stories of Earth Day
Yeah.
is the involvement of the unions, several unions, not all of them, in supporting the Earth Day movement, the teach-in movement, and assisting with funding. Walter Reuther, in particular, as head of the United Auto Workers, had spoken out here at the Earth Day teach-in in Ann Arbor and elsewhere about the importance of trying to address the pollution of the automobile. And he was under a tremendous amount of pressure, some from his own membership, about whether or not that would just threaten their jobs. But I think he understood that in the long run, you had to address these issues up front. And so his office was very supportive. They helped print a lot of our material. They gave money to the office. And one of the most incredible events that occurred after Earth Day was the conference that his organization sponsored at their Black Lake conference facility up in Onaway, Michigan, to bring together all the local activists from the United States, Canada, and some other places to talk about what we would do next. And of course, the tragic death of Walter Reuther in that plane crash in May did not stop that conference. We held it in June of 1970. And a lot of planning around the Clean Air Act Coalition occurred at that conference. So the union and the steel workers and the oil, chemical, and atomic workers were the three unions who were very involved in supporting Earth Day and trying to educate their own membership about the need for pollution control that in the long run would protect their jobs, as opposed to buying into the car company line, which is don't try to control automobile pollution, you'll just shut down jobs.
That's such important history to understand. Yeah.
Very quick quota, because Barbara and I could talk for 50 years. I want to say this, and I don't have documentation other than oral history, but the largest national organization of individual dues-paying memberships that supported the Clean Air Act from the very beginnings of the drafting of it in 67 and 68 was not Sierra Club or Wildlife Federation, it was the United Steelworkers. And they got a grant from HEW to do training to help their structure at the local levels see the benefits of environmental improvement in steel communities.
Yeah, and unions have remained, some more than others, some quite progressive, have remained really critical allies in the environmental movement. The Ecology Center has a long history of working with them. We are organized with the UAW. But I'm really interested to hear from you guys about about all of this. So, yeah, Dim, please.
I was going to say it's really interesting you were talking about the involvement and the integral part that unions played, because I think that we've also seen that with our own Earth Day student activism, whether it's like graduate students or lecturers. GEO, LEO are two very, very important unions that have been constant supports, doing work like printing things for us or giving us, like, imparting knowledge that we wouldn't know. And at least I think you can speak more on their platforms as well, but I think they've really taught us as like undergrads how to integrate demands regarding housing insecurity, food insecurity into environmental justice activism. And I think it's also important to note that oftentimes when progressive groups like unions have demands. It's often institutions like U of M who are very antagonistic to their demands, and I think that that isn't something that like we're going to see change, quickly. But I think that's like a continuing problem.
Yeah, let's hear from Drew, and then Barbara, I'd love to hear from you.
I have a question for the other panelists. And the
please.
panel is, has the issue of who pays for climate justice come before you? Have you engaged in the issue of whether subsidies for electric vehicles or subsidies to install solar on homes? Have you engaged in the dialogue in Lansing and other places here about who pays for that initiative, and tried to calculate, in fact, who pays for those parts of your electric bill? And is it understood that the electric bill is the most regressive way to pay for any climate change agenda you could possibly come up with? Because the poorer you are, the higher percentage of your income has to be allocated to essential electricity and natural gas. So
there are a lot of activists working on that.
I would love to hear stories about how that's happening here in Michigan.
I guess like I don't have any, I can't speak of my personal experiences with that per se. I know that there's a lot of good work being done by the Work for Me DTE Coalition that's based out of Detroit. I don't want to speak for their experiences, but their general demands have been for demands for DTE to stop doing heating shutoffs and power shutoffs to people who can't afford to pay their bills. I know that there is a demand for subsidization of insulation and energy efficiency in housing for people, and in general, I think a lot of that work is pointing to these large institutions that continue to profit off of families and communities and who continue to also further this destruction to be the ones who pay that remediation. I know personally, I have not done a lot of that.
It would be a good research project for all of you to engage in. Let me suggest it.
And there are academics here on campus who are also doing that work as well. So.
That's good.
Any other comments about cross-movement organizing on campus or?
I think in general there's been specifically as of lately in the last couple of years, there has been more coalition building efforts between different movements and different organizations to show true solidarity when movements make demands to make sure that we have each other's backs, and in general to understand that our each of our movements don't exist in a bubble or in a vacuum.
And I know there's been a lot of attempts recently to have climate activists and housing activists join together in solidarity around a number of things because of the importance of housing. Well, let's switch to another question. Lasting social change means changing institutions, whether that's your high school or your university or political institutions, corporations. And so I'm interested in the panel to reflect on the tensions that arise around changing institutions, strategies around changing institutions, how you think about institutional change. Maybe we can start, Barbara, with you.
Well, social change is a result of consensus in society. It's not typically a top-down affair. So there has to be a general consensus that it is politically going to be harmful to you if you don't endorse our agenda for cleaner air, cleaner water. The environmental movement in several years after Earth Day created a Dirty Dozen campaign to get rid of the 12 Congress people that we identified as standing in the way of good pollution control and environmental legislation at the federal level. Something like 10 of the 12 were defeated. And the head of the highway committee was defeated, a very powerful Republican from Maryland, as I recall. That had a tremendous impact on our ability to get the attention of many of the other legislators to get some reform. So you need a consensus that's built from the ground up, but you need some good leadership that with whom you can work and talk and create consensus for what you do in response to your agenda. Because it's easy now to say, oh, we have to act on climate change. I mean, most thinking people understand that. It's what do we do about it that is becoming more of an issue, more into conflict in various locations, state and federal. And there's a real lack of consensus about those next steps. And I just think the message of the younger generation is to try to build the force that allows you to make them afraid that if they don't follow your agenda, they will be voted out of office. Because that's how we do it in a democracy.
Yeah. Let's hear from the younger generation before we go back to George. And Jim, do you want to?
I completely agree with you, Barbara, that like change doesn't come from the top down, and I think especially in like a political year like this one, it's going to be, we're going to see like what they decide to do about climate change. Even just, I think there is a general consensus even in like the DNC that climate change is real, but there's no consensus on what to do. And I think as young people, we for the most part collectively agree that like incrementalism is not good enough, that only addressing climate as a science just in like isolation is not good enough, that you have to address race, that you have to address all these other things. And I think the tension comes when maybe your institutions refuse to work for you, and then you have to kind of just decide as a group, like, what do you do then? And I think that this will sound a little pessimistic, but I think because we live in a democracy and we live in a world where electoral politics is kind of how we have to change some things, I don't think politicians, for the most part, even the Democratic Party, will change because they believe in our values. I think they will only change when they fear that their power will be taken away. And I think that we have to use that to our best advantage. And I also don't think that we can trust our electoral politics to save us, given everything that's happening this year too.
Not the current electoral politics, anyway.
Yeah, I think like, or I guess like in my opinion, any electoral politics. But I think that's also just like, you know,
but what Barbara
maybe I'll
said,
change my mind in 20 years. But
well, leadership tends to respond to social movements. And
and
so
I don't think
it's social movements that make change rather than people at the top typically.
Yeah,
so.
and I don't really think that people, for the most part, vote according to their, or like make changes in government according to their values. So I think you have to find kind of craftier ways to get your message across.
Good idea.
George, you want to jump in?
I agree with both Jim and Barbara about change coming from the bottom, and I have seen examples where passing national legislation saves lives, even though it's not perfect. Try Social Security, try Medicare, try the Clean Air Act, try OSHA, that kind of stuff. The other thing that I would just add are persistence, and I'm delighted as a person over 70 to be here with younger people as part of my persistence. And I honor those mentors, some of whom I'm facing right now, and others who Barbara and I have in common, we won't get into it, who helped me to see these greater connections with the labor movement and other kinds of things. My father was a local union organizer at a university, for instance. And the other thing, though, is you gotta ask a question what is your value? You've got to have the vision. I spent 45 years in Washington, D.C. as an advocate. About halfway through there, I came across a poem by Langston Hughes. And the phrase in there that has motivated me ever since is the land that never has been yet.
But we seek it. Drew, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure, yeah. I think like on the other side of when we fight and we keep going and our persistence does bring around change, I think a lot of like what's next is sometimes not thoroughly discussed. Like I have seen like I have seen, but I guess I've read because this is honestly before my time. I have like about I guess like a bit of a dying out sometimes of like labor movements of different movements, and I think at least in my personal opinion, as far as like how that happens is often the institutions that we try so hard to change co-opt the work that we do. They take these hard fought battles that require so much people power, and they eventually make a legislative change or an institutional change and it's attributed to their own good faith through various forms of marketing themselves, and so I feel like you often see people not believing that, or people not believing that like people power and solidarity works because it lets people develop a faith that institutions are the ones leading these changes when all the work of people on the ground is erased. And I think as far as movements go, that requires like you said, persistence. Even past when some incremental change occurs, in making sure our messages are continually heard, and that placation is not viewed as good enough.
Leela, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I'd like to add on to what you guys have been saying about persistence. And I believe that having the right mindset is very crucial to starting a movement and getting a lot of people to join in solidarity. And from what I've seen as I've tried to make my high school become more sustainable and more green, is that a lot of high schoolers are actually apathetic to joining our cause. And I think it's because many of us, although we do understand the full urgency of the situation that we are placed in, we've become hopeless. And we think that institutions won't listen to us and that they'll always view us as young and naive and emotional. And so whenever I try to recruit people to my movement, I try to instill a lot of feelings of hope within these other youth. And as we try to reach numbers of mass mobilization, I let the other youth know that as long as we have enough numbers that have never been seen before, institutions will be forced to listen to us. And that is what gives me and a lot of other young students hope that we can bring change.
Let me just say it's important, I think, to avoid the doom and gloom scenario as being a big motivator. I don't think that's going to work in the long run. And just being able to explain, we have had significant successes in this country in reducing air and water pollution. And the coal industry is on the way out. And we are doing a lot of low-cost renewables. And cars are much more efficient in terms of emissions than they were when I was a kid, or in 1970 when we started the Clean Air Act. And just understanding that there are good examples for you to use about how to achieve change, and it may not be revolutionary, but it's incremental and it's very meaningful. And building on that and taking the next step and talking about who's paying for the next step and making sure that marginalized communities are not the ones paying and not getting the benefits will be, I think, the role that young people can play in the next 3, 4, 5 years, for sure.
Can I also speak on like the urgency and like kind of defeatist attitude?
Yeah.
I also think I think there's also a difference between like letting people know how urgent climate change is, but then not being very defeatist about it, because you can't go into a community that is already suffering and tell them you're suffering. Like, they know that. And I think for me, like, a lot of my personal experiences drive the work I'm doing. My dad is in a union. He came into this country working in a factory, and I'm from like Myanmar. I was born there, and that's going to be one of the countries that's going to be most affected by climate change. So you have to have a better strategy than to tell people the world is like dying. And I think that's also something that like we're continuously working to hone in our message and values.
Good for you. That's great.
But I'm interested in, Barbara, that you talked about incremental change, and one of the challenges I think we have now with climate is that we have to change more and more quickly than we've done before. And that, I think, is a challenge that we all face, right? To build on what we've done before, but to do it, accelerate it, right? And so,
Why do we need to accelerate it?
only because the time, the time we have is more limited. So some of the battles, although I'm interested to hear a little bit more about how quickly some of the major fundamental environmental legislation was passed relatively quickly after the first Earth Day.
Yeah, well, it was. Yeah, 1970 Clean Air Act. And then there were amendments again to strengthen it in 1972. And we had the 1972 Water Act and amendments added to that since then.
That fundamentally transformed the country in a matter of a few years. I mean,
well, it created a federalization of what the standards had to be, so that the states weren't fighting with each other about who was going to save what job, and it was called environmental blackmail. If you try to shut down pollution from this stack at this pulp mill in Maine, we'll just move it out of town. But with the federal law, you had uniformity in approach. And guess what? Technology, when forced to develop ways to improve pollution control mechanisms and adopt conservation at the plant level, it made a significant difference. The appropriate lever is what needs to be identified. And where you can get the best bang for your buck. And don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, is my approach, or my recommendation anyway. Our planet is not going to collapse because the United States misses some little percentage on its climate change agenda. I just have to say for a fact that this, we can overstate what's going on here terribly. And if you really want to address climate change, you're going to have to go to China, India, and various other countries who vastly exceed the emissions that we're putting into the air currently. So my point is we need to take reasonable steps to make reasonable progress and make people see that this is not something that will, because politically it will not be sold any other way. You're not going to sell a climate change agenda to the vast majority of Americans who have to think of themselves as reducing their quality of life and their ability to make a living and live in their homes and have transport available to them. So somehow we have to come to grips with that underlying political reality facing us with this issue.
sure, I'm interested in if you guys have a reaction to that.
Yeah, I guess that like keeping in mind the fact that we live in a globalized economy and a globalized world, in which I do think a lot of like federal legislation that that established like standards for clean air and like environmental standards within our borders has done a lot to help like many communities, but also that in this globalized economy, these same like U.S.-based companies will continue to move on to I guess the easiest target, and like the places where they can get away with the most where they can get away with like with the lowest standards possible, and I think like in general making sure our work is in global solidarity with people everywhere.
I like applaud all the change that happened, especially after the first Earth Day, and I think that what we're trying to do here is like kind of replicate all the good that came out of it. And I also think that like the Earth will be fine; it's the people who won't be. And I think even when we discuss like
Good point.
Even when we discuss the United States and how if we miss one little thing, like we will be okay. I think we are also ignoring the global implications of that. There's plenty of communities in the United States who are not okay. And I also, just like speaking as like a first generation immigrant too, like I know the reasons why my parents and so many of my friends' families left, different countries. For me, Asia, because of U.S. imperialism, because of U.S. capitalism and the negative effects that it had, and that's why we're here. So I would agree with Drew that like we can't ignore the global implications of why these missions are happening.
And to add on to what you guys are saying about global solidarity, I don't think that we can, talk the talk without walking the walk. And the United States has had a foundation that is pretty much set in the fossil fuel industry and the oil companies. And although I think it would be awesome to push China and other big polluters to like cut down their emissions and protect people from all over the continent all over the world who is already feeling the effects of climate change first and foremost. And I think that changing the foundation of the United States that has been set in these corrupt fossil fuel industries is going to take a lot more than just regulations for clean air and clean water, which I applaud, but there's definitely going to be more radical change that will have to occur.
Could I just also tack something on? Just as far as like how we talk about the timeline of like how much time do we have left to make these big like, cuts in global emissions. The science is at least I believe that it's sound. I am no expert, I guess, and I have not done the math on myself. I think a lot of the discourse that goes on around that, like we have 11 years now, is it? Ignores the fact that people are hurting right now, and people have hurt for many years before this, and that at that 11 years, it's not like suddenly everyone's gonna start hurting. That's just when people
It's even worse.
Well, it gets even worse, but also that's just when the people in power and those who are of more privilege will start feeling the effects more too. And it's very feasible that the most privileged among us will never feel the effects of climate change, but that doesn't mean that there are communities that don't. And so I think, in general, like as we have this discourse, it's prudent to be like to be sensitive in the way that in the way that timeline is talked about, knowing that people's lives will always people's lives will continue to be at risk up until that point too. And yeah,
I think the urgency of taking action and dramatic, substantive, not incremental action has been one of the contributions that the youth movement has made to the conversation that I think is so critical. And recognizing all the people that are being harmed now, that are being displaced, all the refugees that are a result of climate right now. All of that, I think, adds a sense of urgency to the conversation that I think is really critical.
And then I would suggest that even more urgent is the decision about what you want to do about it and who's going to pay for it. And I haven't heard much about that, to be honest with you. And that's where the lack of consensus lies. Creating a sense of emergency and then not coming forward with an agenda that acknowledges the costs and decides who's going to pay and how we're going to pay for it is something that is missing from the current debate. And it exacerbated by the incredible income disparity that it occurs now in our society and that was not present in 1970. We had a booming post-war economy. We had a growing middle class. And I'm not going to deny at all severe racial and adverse discriminatory aspects of the society at that time. I'm just saying that there was an understanding that federal laws might result in costs, but because we had a growing economy that was growing a lot of boats at once, it was not as dramatic a decision as it is now, where you have a very small group of very wealthy people, and we've lost a lot of our ability to have a growing middle class to absorb the agenda that we all probably could come up and sit here and design if we wanted to. So it's going to be even more difficult, it seems to me, to achieve our desired objectives here without a very careful examination of who pays and how much.
Just to say that the global climate meetings, that's a major topic of conversation. You know, the Global South is asking for the world to pay.
It's the global paralysis in the entire movement. As a result.
Did you guys want to respond to that?
Okay. So in the 1970s and now, you mentioned how the economic income has been widening exponentially since then.
Yes.
And I was actually learning in school that it was because tax cuts on the wealthy have been decreasing ever since Reagan's administration. And most of those wealthy 1% have been being key polluters and have been sending money to lobbyists and other fossil fuel companies that have been working within the government. And I think in order to reduce the gap and make people who have been key, what do I want to say, creators of corruption, if we were to tax them more, they would finally pay for their corruption and mistakes, I guess.
That's part of it, but there's also structural defects in our economy. We've moved from manufacturing to social services. And look what coronavirus is going to do to all of the vast number of people in our economy who are basically needing weekly paychecks, hourly wages. We have no national health care program. We have no national health care to protect people from the adverse impacts of disease and other things. We don't have child care. There's a lot that is not available to us to cushion the blow. And that disparity is frankly what is giving rise, in my opinion, to a lot of anger and frustration with what they view as the federal government. They don't know the story about who's paying taxes. They don't know the story about why we don't have universal health care. So there's a lot of work ahead for all of us on all of those issues to get to the point where we can afford to talk about the mitigation and the what we need to do to address some of the climate change issues in our society. Because it's not just a couple corrupt polluters, it's all of us. We're all driving cars.
George, did you want to weigh in on this?
Well, the issue of institutional change, I think, I'm thinking of Citizens United, I'm thinking of election fairness and reforms and ways like that. I'm thinking of how we can come up with, those of us on this panel who know the answer, how we can convince people not to vote against their own self-interest, which has always been a challenge, and those are key institutional changes, cultural change. Lily's had her cell phone in her hand for the whole time. Mine is ringing because I don't really know how to turn it off. So maybe you can show me later. I think I do. You push the button either on the left or the right, one of the two. But it's new, Barb. It's only about 2 weeks old.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I wonder
Changing the way that we communicate, and as we get into this whole new era, I see it as like the evolution of the printing press in the 1400s. Now we have cyberspace, and how we shape, I don't know if that's really an institution, but how we shape that for social change is really, really important. Yeah. I'm looking this way. I'm looking this way for advice.
I guess, like, I don't know if I necessarily have an answer to that. but I do want to speak to like the non-linearity of a lot of the work that is being done, that needs to be done, and also touching back, I guess, like way back to where we started on solidarity between movements, in that the demands of so many movements happening all over the world and among so many different spaces are all, I guess, looking for they're all looking for ways to cushion this blow of the daily hurt that comes with existing within this economy and within this society. I guess like you said specifically about cars, right? And like there I know there are at least a couple movements around the world, and I know a couple specifically in the U.S. demanding for cheap public transit, free public transit, increased removal of oppressive zoning codes, and in general, like this overall coordination coordination and sharing of power between all these all these different people and all these different movements is a step towards making demands and making change in a bunch of different areas at the same time, so that progress in one area doesn't come at the expense of people in another.
I think this is such an important point to talk about, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit more, is that the overlapping nature of many of these issues, the importance of, that climate is linked to housing, is linked to mass transportation, it is linked to the availability of healthcare, all of that interlinking, and so sometimes it can seem overwhelming to trying to make change around a whole range of social justice issues that needs to move forward. So how do you guys think about that, and the importance of addressing a lot of injustice?
I think, I think one way in which groups like the Climate Action Movement and Sunrise address our interconnectedness is that if we as just one group have just one demand, and we are able to, get that demand.
Focus.
For example, U of M freezing fossil fuel investments. But then then what comes after that? That's one demand that we have, but what about all the other groups that we're working in solidarity with? And I think an example would just be, you mentioned briefly, the Black Action Movement. They've had, the Black Student Union has had demands since the 70s. Which is an increase in enrollment of Black students, and Black enrollment has decreased. And that's not a community I can speak for, but I can speak for a little bit of the Asian American community. Like, we have our own demands. Like, we don't have ethnic studies department of our own. Our ethnic data isn't disaggregated, and it's really hard to figure out which group at U of M needs like which resources. And I think one way that like both Leela and Drew mentioned is that we can't forget that like our demands are just one part of the whole story. And I think that's why we have been taking the time to kind of hone our values really, really intentionally, so that we're not co-opting someone else's work, or that we're not replicating movements. Because we are students, there's a cycle of like every 4 or 5 years.
There you go.
And trying to make sure that any knowledge we have is imparted on like the next set of leaders. And I think that takes time, and we don't have all the answers either. I barely have answers about postgrad, especially now. So I think all we can do is keep in mind that like we are one movement. We are just one part of a globalized world, and how do we make sure that any success we achieve, other people can feel the effects too.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, you were saying, Barbara, focus, that to make change, you really do need to focus, and at the same time, you want to make sure that what you're demanding doesn't have implications for other movements that you don't want. And I think you can show up in solidarity for other movements, seek areas where you have common ground, and work together while still focusing on, in order to be able to really make any change. But I think this is a perennial issue of activists, and so anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess I bet my focus, pick your battles. You can't do it all, so you can't get frustrated with not being able to do it all. And if your high school is determined to work on sustainable food at your high school, or sustainable energy use at your high school, or whatever your project is, it's an incredible training ground for the rest of your life. And that, as being young, you should focus on what am I doing, not only to help my objective, but to help me understand how to get something done. And at the end of that, then you can go on to bigger and better things that you want to get done. So that's.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think choosing a demand and a target is all about the impact of it. Because there are some minor things that, although it would be nice to focus on, such as sustainable food and waste, there are a lot more impactful things that would become like more impactful to our future, such as moving to solar energy and wind power. So I think as one of the core issues in our movement, it is always trying to find which demand we want to focus on the most, and which one would drive the message that we need to fight for our futures the hardest.
Choosing a strategic demand, I'm so glad that you talked about that, because it's when you have to focus, you do need to think about what is your strategic demand that will make broader change and also message in the way that you want.
I think like you said, like focusing on a singular demand, a singular issue, as far as like a personal level, and even as like a small group level, but and at the same time communicating well amongst like across movements, across different groups, because one person, one small group is not going to do it all. They're not going to make all the change. They're not going to change everything, but they can be cognizant of the effects of their work on others and the effects of others' work on them, and maintaining constant maintaining constant communication, constant understanding, as well as understanding that your own work is no more or less important than others, and that your own goals don't come at the expense of others, because in general organizing is supposed to be selfless. It's supposed to be for the community. It's supposed to be for all the community.
Lovely.
Yes. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? We just have a few more minutes, so I wonder if you have questions for each other. We have a couple of other questions, but we don't have that much time to talk about them. So I wonder if you wanted any questions or. If not,
Yeah, I guess just like maybe how'd you do it is a little too broad. But I do know that that being in these spaces and constantly doing this work is tiring, and it's a grind, and it's full of not failures, but it certainly doesn't have the but it certainly does take a long time often to get anything done. So I guess how do you keep going?
Welcome to the real world. Yes.
I'll speak to that without saying I really ever got anything done. No,
There you go.
I did. One is to look for mentors to ask, to assertively do that in some cases. And there'll be a stage in your life based on experience, I think, of folks my age, where you see yourself kind of not asking so much for mentorship, but looking for people that you can mentor to share your experience over the years. And I'm still welcome. You all can give me a cell phone lesson. I'm still into that. But what I learned is to look around and to really listen to people and try to think, where have I heard that before in a different way, and maybe even put those folks together if you can. At a conference or linking them up by email or something like that. I had some success in the 80s when I worked at the Rural Coalition on the issue of land loss, which is large corporations taking over lands. 40 acres and a mule, the black farms in the South, were being passed third and fourth generations. Some plots of 100 acres or something had 80 heirs to the original great-grandpa who got it after the Civil War. And the timber companies were taking over and planting pine trees like carrots and linking that kind of concern up with people in tribal areas who were losing their lands, for instance. I see you.
yeah, we're close to the end. Did
We're
you want to
running.
say? We just have really less than a minute.
There is no change that happens in a perfect way from the point of view of starting what you want and having to be satisfied with what you've got. So, and the passage of time, which is very difficult when you're young because it all has to happen right now. I mean, I vaguely remember that feeling. But to know that persistent work will make change in this society. It will. And you just need to look at long-term change that has occurred in the last 50 years or the last 10 years, and you will see differences. And I would urge you to set your sights high and not be discouraged when it takes longer than you think it should.
Thank you all. Do you want to say any last?
I guess
Yeah.
like you have been in our spot before in our place, and I think like there's a lot of talks about our generation, but I have like immense faith in my generation. Like in the audience, there's a lot of like allies like Logan and Juan and Sophia and Luke and like people on this panel. And I think people that I know at the school, like in surrounding communities, are some of the hardest working, most persistent activist organizers that I know. And I, unfortunately, like, I think all we can hope for now, we have our demands, they're on our websites, they're everywhere. We just hope that institutions listen because I think that student power is like going to be here for a really long time.
thank you all so much for a really interesting conversation. We so appreciate it, and thanks for those who joined the live stream, joined us digitally. The next session starts at 5:15, so tune in for that. And thanks again.
Thank you, students.
Thank you so
Great
much.
to meet you.